I don't know who poured this concrete, but I do know that I hate them. It's Wednesday again, and you know what that means. That means it's time to grab another fantastic lump of scrap iron from the pile and wrench on it in another thrilling installment of Engine Wednesday. No, we're not building a blown Hemi today. And we're not working on the new engine for Perky either, although I promise you things are happening. We're not building a 340 for a Demon either, at least not yet. But we are going to work on the next best thing, a close relative of the 340, and that would be an LA 360 engine, specifically that one. Yes, I'm going to build one that's buried 3 deep in the pile for some reason. To excavate that bad boy, I think I only need to move 2 big blocks, 2 426 Hemis, and a slant 6. Sure made that sound easy, didn't I? Today's video is not sponsored by the black and yellow totes, but they were on a great sale down at the Home Depot, and I bought a bunch. That was a good move. In addition to all that, I also had to excavate the table, which meant putting away 2 engines worth of hardware and odds and ends, and so many other things. Why do I do the things that I do? I don't know. Anyway, hours later, we're looking at a 360 block finally. As with so many of my projects, this one has a story. It's been in this shop for years now. It used to sit kind of where this table is, with like 6 or 7 other engines, most of which I got from the same place. As you can probably tell, this thing is nicely finished. It's painted black, it's got core plugs installed already, the inside of the block is done with that fancy Gliptol stuff. Obviously, it's got fresh cam bearings as well. I bought this engine in the condition you see it, already machined, cleaned, and ready to rock and roll, from a gentleman named Butch. He was going to put this thing together for a short bed Dodge truck, but at some point he changed his mind. The project sat there unfinished. He reached out to a friend of mine who is also a Mopar enthusiast in the area, and he connected me with Butch, thinking I'd probably want to buy this thing. I did, and it cost me a pretty penny because he had a stack of receipts. This was in the pretty early days of my channel, long before my Engine Wednesday series was a thing. And it wasn't too long after I had built this, the Shed-Built 360. The Shed-Built 360 turned out to be capable of doing some pretty awesome things, and it's reliably propelled Dale's Demon there into the high 7s in the 8th mile. But I wasn't all that happy with the video that I produced on the process, or with some of the various decisions that were made when we were screwing that thing together. So when I got this thing, it seemed like a great opportunity for a do-over. So I dug in on this engine and started filming a video. It didn't take me long to realize I was going to need to file fit the rings for this thing, something we're still going to have to deal with. I remembered right away that I actually hate doing that. I also realized I didn't really need the same exact 360 I already had, so the whole operation kind of became pointless. Some other small inconvenience came up, and I shoved this thing to the side for like 3 years. And then this project came along. You may recognize this thing from a video I made like, I don't know, a year and a half ago when I bought it and got it running for the first time in quite a while. It's a 1978 Dodge D100 long bed pickup, and it's kind of cool. That's where I left that battery? Under the hood of this truck currently, we find your standard cruising Model 318 2-barrel. It's certainly nothing to write home about. It does run, kind of, sort of decent, but it also billows oil smoke everywhere, so that, admittedly, is not great. Yeah. One big thing this truck needs, in addition to some engine work, is a hood. We're still looking for one of those. Longtime channel supporter and gold member Josh decided he needed to own this truck, so I was happy to sell it to him. And he knew it needed an engine. I was happy to sell him one of those too. Dude, there's a 2-barrel air cleaner in here. Could have used that a couple days ago. Still need to fix this. I probably have parts for that now, actually. Josh named the truck Crapple, which is kind of hilarious, actually. He wasn't in any hurry for this project to come together either, which is good. That's pretty much essential if you're going to try and have me do anything for you. His requirements were a little bit of horsepower and a muscle car sound. Our 360 here is definitely capable of delivering those things. He was entertaining thoughts of picking the truck up in the winter. Last winter, that is. I may not be the best of friends from time to time. But today, at long last, I'm finally getting back to this project. I'm going to dig in on this 360, go through all of the components, and figure out the next steps. I imagine several of those steps will be cleaning dust off parts. Not right now, though. Right now, I'm going to go eat lunch. I'm back. I'm full of Hot Pocket and caffeine, and I'm ready to party. This is a 1977 cast 360 block. The date is actually 7/14/77. So this probably would have been in a 78 model truck. Or not a truck, but probably a truck. That means it's correct for Crapple. Not that that matters in any way. It also doesn't matter in any way what application this engine originally came out of. A 360 block is a 360 block. 1972, which I think is the first year for the 360, until it turned into a Magnum, they're all essentially exactly the same. I guess the later years do have provisions for roller cams and such. There's no good 360 block. There's no high nickel 360 block. There's no thick-walled 360 block. They are all the same, and it doesn't matter what one you start with for a build. The same is true, of course, of most of these Chrysler engine families, like the 440, for example. This one is not an original HP, but it's exactly the same as a similar year 440 HP. You may have noticed the main caps are not on the block. They're over here. They've been wrapped up all this time, and they still look fantastic. I thoroughly cleaned this block in preparation for assembly, but again, that was years ago. It's been sitting in this shop wrapped in a plastic bag the whole time, so it's still pretty clean, but that doesn't mean it's just ready to go. Little bits of debris have found their way in here, and also some moisture, unfortunately. There's some very light surface rust stuff I'm going to have to deal with. Not a big deal, but annoying, and fully my fault, obviously. We're not doing anything special with the block. No oiling system modifications, no grinding down the casting flash. As you can see, no one else cared to do that before the block got coated. I'm not really planning on repainting it either. It's already done in a really nice coat of black, although for some reason, they didn't hit this spot, which of course is exposed next to the timing cover. I've only just realized I don't actually have a timing cover for this engine, which is unfortunate. This oil pan, the set of heads, and the block are all painted really nicely to match, but I'm gonna have to paint a cover now. Maybe we will change the color, I don't know. Notice that's a mid-sum car oil pan, so it's actually useless for this build anyway. We'll get back to that in a bit. I mentioned the cylinder head, so I guess we could take a look at one of those real quick. This is your standard cruising model 1970s 360 cylinder head casting. It's got a number here of 3671587. That date appears to say 0523. So this is a 1973 cast head, if I'm understanding that correctly. Now this is a smog era head. You can see it does have the pads here for the air injection ports, but they aren't machined or drilled in any way. It turns out the 587 is a 73 and 4 only head. These were used on 340s in 1973, the last year of that engine. There are later smog 360 heads that use a different casting number, but they're of a very, very similar design. This is kind of a random aside, but I have the pieces here to show you, so I figured I'd go ahead and do that. I've discussed this fitment issue with A-body exhaust manifolds and these smog era 360 heads in a couple videos in the past. You might run into this yourself if you're going to try and build one of these engines and put it in an A-body. Here's what happens. The big swoopy section of the manifold right here runs into that big smog pad there. And if you just try to bolt this manifold on, it's going to sit like this and it will never, ever seal. The way I've taken to fixing this issue is by using a Remflex header gasket and cutting out the little section that would be right in that area. That spaces the manifold out just enough with that extra thick material. It seals right up and you have no problem. The other way to fix it, of course, is with a grinder right here. Now, don't you think for a moment that because these are smog era cylinder heads, they're garbage or no good for making horsepower. I used a set of the exact same heads on that 360 in the Demon, and that thing's just about done wheelies. These are, of course, a small valve head. They don't have the big gigantic 202s that the legendary 340X heads did. But aside from that, they basically have all the same potential. And of course, if you're feeling spicy, you certainly can fit them with the 202 valves. Obviously, to make that upgrade effective, there are other supporting mods required. Couple more things to point out here. I think these actually got all new valves, just looking at how that stuff looks. And obviously these are brand new damper equipped performance valve springs. That yellow paint marking is something I've seen on various sets of small block heads. I don't know what springs these are. I don't know what the pressures are, but they're probably going to be perfect for what we're trying to do here. Looking at the scratches here on the intake sealing surface, it's immediately obvious that this head has been dragged across a steel workbench many times. It wasn't me. Notice, with our 360 intake gasket set in place, the ports are pretty close to that opening size. Not exactly a perfect match. It doesn't look to me like this thing's ever been ported. I take that back. It does look like there was a gasket match done, but that's pretty much it. Obviously, there was a cleanup decking job done here. You can see the cutter reached that little bit of the casting. You see that sometimes. The more meat they take off, the more of that gets hit. But look at these chambers. They have been ground down and polished. That is really interesting. As I understand, this is an extra step that can be beneficial when you're trying to make a bunch of horsepower, but I don't think that's what they were trying to do here. So why did they do that? Maybe they were bored. Or maybe something went through this engine and these heads were damaged. I'm not sure. Regardless, it looks pretty good. Better than the average 360 Mopar head. Being a 1973 casting, I don't actually know if these came with hardened seats from the factory or not. It doesn't appear to me that hardened seat inserts were installed in these heads. One other thing, I did notice they installed the nice positive seal type valve stem seals on this head. Like the block, these heads have been bagged the whole time. There are still some little rusty spots and bits of gunk I'm going to have to clean off. Things unfortunately get a little uglier over here in the crankshaft department. This, like everything else, is a factory 360 piece. This was machined by the company that did everything else, Britco. The same people that recently did my 426 race Hemi block. You can see on the tag here, the rod bearing surfaces are at 20 thousandths under size. The mains are actually at 30. They did provide new bearings in the appropriate sizes. These are from Engine Pro, a brand I'm not really familiar with. These are a high-performance full groove bearing. Actually, what they are is doubled top bearings. See, these all have oiling holes? Yeah, those are block half shells. We just install half of them in the block and half of them in the caps where they fit perfectly. These bearings don't have dates on them at all, so I have no idea when they were made or how long they've been sitting around waiting to go in this thing. At least 3 or 4 years at this point. I did notice that this box says made in China on it, which I'm not very excited about. The thrust surfaces look really nice compared to the ones I usually see. Obviously, we'll be checking to make sure we have proper thrust in a while here. Anyway, back to the crank. Like the other pieces, it was bagged. Unfortunately, the bag didn't fit, and it had a second bag on the bottom. It wasn't sealed at all. And apparently, last winter, when the shop kind of sort of flooded, this thing got damp. So that sucks. I'm going to have to clean all this nastiness off. I don't see any aftermarket balancing type work done to this crank. It's using an aftermarket KB piston, which we'll look at in a minute here. If this is still a production balanced crank, well, in theory, I could just grab another 360 crank and throw it in here and everything would be fine, but I don't really want to do that. How much grime was I supposed to fling into my coffee? Oh yeah, today's video is also not sponsored by Chris with Coffee Dudes Roasters in Anderson, Indiana, but it is powered by them. This is by no means a paid advertisement. He didn't even ask me to mention him, but he did send me a bag of free beans, and they're delicious. So, I don't know, if you need coffee beans, maybe look these guys up. Thanks, Chris. Yes, we're going to do some actual work. Hold your horses, we're almost there. Here's one of the rod and piston assemblies. This piston, as I mentioned, is a KB. It's a KB 107. What size are you? I don't remember. 20? You'd think it would say that somewhere. Oh, I think that's 30. The world's crappiest measuring device confirms these bores are in fact 4.03-ish inches. The factory 360 size, of course, is 4 inches dead. These are factory rods. Just about every engine I've ever built used factory rods, so that checks out. They do have ARP rod bolts in very nice condition. They might be just about brand new. Factory 360 rods use a pressed pin. These are not full floaters. There are no bushings in here. You can spend money to have them bush, but clearly this person did not do that. And that's fine for your typical street engine. For high performance, it would be really nice to have that. Obviously, if this was a fully floating piston pin, there would be clips in these KB pistons. You can see there are grooves for them, but no clips are necessary in this application. No grinding, no polishing, and no weight taken off these rods either. Here's the rod cap off number 2. It doesn't say number 2 on it. It says that. I don't know what that is, but the marking on the rod matches. This looks pretty good, I guess. Maybe that's been resized at some point. This groove for the oil squirter looks bigger than normal to me. Could be my imagination. These send oil over to the opposing bank to cool the piston skirts and add extra lubrication in there. Some rod bearings don't even have the cutout for those anymore because they've been deemed unnecessary. These bearings, which were Clevites, did have the cutout, but it's a lot smaller than that. The new bearings do not have it at all. You could add this with a file, if you were a gigantic nerd. I can't remember the story of this engine exactly, and I wish I could because it seems like it might be kind of interesting. For one thing, 7 of these pistons match, but 1 does not. This is one of those KB 107 pistons. Notice the valve reliefs are asymmetrical. There's a big one there and a smaller one there, and they're actually offset ever so slightly. They look like this because the exhaust reliefs are cut a little bit deeper into the piston. This is odd because I found multiple pictures of KB 107s online. Some look exactly like this, with the separate depth valve reliefs and then the notches on the sides. But in at least 1 or 2 pictures, they look exactly like this. It's the same basic design, but without the deeper cutting under the exhaust and without the notches to the edges there. Because this piston was ground for balancing, I can't tell you what the original number on it was. Obviously, it's a KB, and it does look very similar in configuration to the other 107s, except for those details. I guess the big question here is, why do we have one mismatched piston? That might well have something to do with this. This is valve contact, and as you can see, it's above the smaller exhaust valve cutout. So I'm wondering if maybe someone did not know that these reliefs were asymmetrical when they put this engine together previously, and they just threw them in there all willy-nilly instead of in the correct left-right configuration. These reliefs certainly have enough space for our standard 1.6-inch exhaust valves, if they even got anywhere close to the piston. And if you look at this marking here, it's pretty obvious that that was left by a much larger diameter valve. That could only be an intake valve. Naturally, I was curious, so I inspected all of the pistons for marks. I found 3 that have marks, 4 originals that do not, and the 1 replacement. The positions don't tell us much. Number 2 has a mark, number 5 has a mark, and this one is not numbered. There are actually a few that aren't numbered, which is not particularly helpful. And it's not like looking at the rods helps us either, because again, these are not marked with numbers. They're marked with symbols. Or most of them are anyway. What I said there was most of them, but that actually turns out to not be true either. Some of them have the correct 70s era markings. I learned on this 1978 318 that for a time, the factory was marking their rods not with numbers, but with random stamped markings. They were used to denote the rod and cap that matched each other, but they had nothing to do with the order they were installed in the engine. A good few other people in comments on this channel have told me they've seen the same exact thing in their engines. Some speculated that it was some rebuilder somewhere leaving those markings, but I am completely sure this was a factory deal. Things get just a little bit weirder here though. These rods are all the same 360 rods. They have the casting number, forging number, part number, whatever, of 3418645. That's a typical 360 rod. Those 3 have those weird stampings. All the rest of these have numbers. These 2 are 80s rods. They have these later foundry marks. I don't know what they mean, but again, it's the same number. It's a totally different mismatched rod. Those 2 are the same. This one, it doesn't match any of these. And it has a number instead of a weird stamping. And then you've got these 2. These 2 are weird looking. I don't know what to think. I don't know if these are a much later replacement rod. They still have the same number on them. And they too have stampings with numbers instead of the original markings. The one I showed you before does not have a balance marking, but these have had some material ground off to match the weight. Okay, that one's been ground on some as well. My thinking was that the rod, which was in whatever hole lost a piston here, was damaged, and the one next to it was damaged too, which is how we ended up with these 2 guys, until I noticed that it's actually just a bunch of mismatched crap. So now I don't know what's going on. I have so many questions. I guess the most important one is if the weights match between all of these various rod and piston assemblies. I don't exactly have precision equipment on hand to check this, but I do have a random spring scale. It's like bang on 1400 grams. Okay. Pretty much right there. Here's our mismatched piston. It is just a hair heavier, but pretty close. Here's another one that's just a skosh heavier. I did check all of them. Here's the very last one, also just a bit heavier than 1400 grams, but basically they're all right in that range. Now the other concern with this mismatched piston would be a difference in compression height, leading to a possible difference in compression in just this one hole. As near as I can tell, the pin height is the same, the ring grooves are all the same, the construction in general seems to be identical. Now in addition to the compression height, there is an obvious difference in the design of these valve reliefs. There could be a difference in the volume of those reliefs between these 2 different pistons. I could try and check that. I'm not going to. I'm pretty sure they're close enough. What I want to know here is if the weight is similar between these assemblies and a factory 360 piston and rod. If it is, that would explain why this was not balanced. I've got that one 360 piston I came up with hanging from the scale now. I did remove the rings to make this a pretty fair comparison. Keep in mind, it is dirtier than our shiny new ones here. It's 1400 and change, basically a match for the heaviest of this set. That's pretty darn close for production tolerances, I think. I don't think Butch ever had this engine together and running. I think he got it half blown up and pieced back together from someone else, then took it to the machine shop to finish cleaning and prepping the block and the heads. I don't think he wanted a spring for balancing. I think they determined this was close enough to work, and I think that's fine. We're not going to be spinning 6,500 RPM and making 400 horsepower with this assembly. I don't anticipate any issues. Now the KB107, plus whatever goofy number this is a hyper-eutectic piston. You can see these have a high-mounted top ring, so these are going to have to use a bigger gap than a traditional piston would have. Because I don't exactly have the KB paperwork for these used pistons, I don't have the specifications for the ring end gaps. Of course, I've done many sets of these, but I wouldn't necessarily trust my memory. I went and found a copy of the sheet online. I came up with a spec of 0065 for the top ring as a gap factor for a naturally aspirated street engine like this one. Multiplying that by our bore size, which is 4.03 inches, we get a required gap for the top ring of 26 thousandths. Strangely, there was no spec for the second ring on that sheet. I seem to recall something like 0.0045 being a typical factor for the second ring. Did the math there, and that got us an 18 thousandths gap for the second. That sounds pretty good to me. Here's where things get super fun. We've currently got a gap, if that'll go in its home, of 15 thou in the top ring, which means I need to grind that thing 11 thousandths. That would be super easy to do with my ring grinder, if only it were here. It's been at Rocket for like 6 months, so I'm either gonna have to wait to do this or grind them by hand. I'm kind of bouncing around a little bit here, and I would apologize, but that's kind of just how I've always operated. Anyway, I want to cover the other things that I have for this engine before I start doing anything useful. You can see here we've got a box of new lifters. Pretty sure these are Johnson's. The Johnson lifters usually do come from EPW in a box just like this one. Obviously the box has been kind of damp, so that's not great news. Yep, they're lifters. I also have replacement factory length push rods here. Those are, of course, for the standard stamped steel hydraulic style rockers, which we will be installing on this thing. Not that it came with any. This engine came with a Mopar purple shaft. I wasn't planning to use this, partially because I thought it was a big block cam. I thought that because I read this piece of paperwork that came from Delta Cams. Butch sent this to them to have it cleaned and checked out. According to this paperwork, it's a big block cam. I probably should have looked at it, because if I'd done that, I would have realized right away this is actually a small block cam. Beyond that, according to my rudimentary measuring tools anyway, and I'm not using the crappiest one in the world here, I'm using the second crappiest one, wherever I put that. Anyway, I measured an exhaust lobe and an intake lobe, and I came up with 330 lift at the lobe for the exhaust and 315 for the intake. That would equal out to 495 exhaust, 472 intake lift with a 1:5 rocker ratio. I've never been known to be the greatest at precise measuring or anything, but I am going to try to do this a slightly more precise way. By measuring lobe lift using my magnetic base dial indicator. I've slipped the cam into the engine for this job. Hey, what do you know? It spins perfectly in those bearings. So that's the good news. The not so good news is, because I don't have a crankshaft yet, I can't exactly degree this thing and check the duration. Here we are on the intake lobe, coming up. 100 thou, 200, 310, 20, 30, 5. That's pretty darn close to what Delta measured. Okay, so maybe just throw away the crappy mic. Got it. This difference in measurements presents a bit of a problem. Although we're just looking at strictly lift here, which doesn't really tell us a whole lot about the camshaft's properties, that number is more in line with the mild street cams I've used in the past, while that number is huge. And if this duration number is correct, almost 250 degrees on the intake side at 50 thou, that's nuts. Funny story. I think it's actually this cam. I think it's the same exact cam that I got another one of and put in the Barracuda engine. There's big and then there's stupid big. And that's exactly what this would be for this application. So that one's out. And now I'm looking at other camshafts in my collection to see if I have anything remotely suitable. I've got a factory 318 cam reproduction from Melling. 390 lift. We don't want that. This one is something interesting. This came with the Demon. If I recall correctly, it's the cheater cam that Dale ran in the day. It measures at 450 lift, but if you look at that lobe, it's super chunky. I think the duration is something kind of wild. Anyway, this thing might have been a contender, but it's a little crusty. And more importantly than that, I found dings on at least a couple lobes. I do not love that. Also, I'd kind of like to just hang on to it. That cam lives in this box for a Comp XE274. You can see the specifications for that. It's closer to what we want. Of course, it's not actually in here. It's in my 340, and I'm totally considering robbing that for this project. Still definitely overkill, though. I'm not at all opposed to running a used cam and lifter setup if it looks good, and if the lifters were saved in the order they came out. I've done it before, I'll do it again. Something that's known to be good, none of the lifters or lobes are destroyed, that sounds like a good candidate for reuse to me. And I have more of them. This engine, for example, is the 318 that was running my Demon for years. I decided to have a look at this cam. I know it's not stock, it's something of a performance bent, but I don't know any of the specifications. I did knock out the rear cam plug looking for some numbers. Didn't find any. Check that out. This thing was punched too far and it was actually contacting that cam. That probably made a cool sound. It sure would be easy to turn this thing over and get a lift measurement. If only it would rotate. My brother's engine I'm storing literally forever out of the Fury has a nice cam in it. Should I disappear that? Would he ever notice? So unfortunately for now, I don't think we have a camshaft for this build. The good news is I have lots and lots of grinding cores here. So I'll probably end up shipping 1 or like 10 of these off to Oregon Cams, and we'll get something made specifically for this build. Obviously we have lifters for this build, but while I'm at it, I do have just a couple sets of lifters that need refaced. This shipping bill is going to get expensive. There are a couple more mysteries I need to solve before trying to assemble this unit. One of those is which piston goes where. See, numbers 2, 4, 6, and 5 have numbers written on them by hand. Number 1 was in a bag labeled number 1. The rod actually says number 2. The valve positions work for number 1, not for number 2, and the rod is oriented the correct way for it to go here. The numbers on the rods themselves really aren't all that important. Because of the asymmetrical reliefs, and again, to prevent that, we have to ensure that these valve reliefs are in an exhaust intake, intake exhaust pattern, or little big, big little. With that in mind, this piston could go in 2 locations, number 3 or number 7. We actually have 2 set up the same. One of these will be number 3, one of these will be number 7. It doesn't matter which is which. I don't know why my one looks like a game of hangman, so I added several other ones of different designs to help clear this up. This grimy one will be number 3, this will be number 7. Done. Oh, no, don't be dumb. That means our special guy here has to be number 8. It's essential that the notches for the bearing shells in your rods are facing outward when looking at a given cylinder bank. This ensures that the cheek of the rod, the tall section, is facing the correct direction, that is, toward the crankshaft. I did also verify that all of these disparate rods have the same ARP fasteners, which they do. With all of that established, we now have an installation order for these things, and we're good to move on to the next step. What is that next step? Why, cleaning, of course. And there's going to be lots of it. I'm going to start with the crankshaft because it's the absolute worst. I'm going to use a brass bristled brush here to clean off most of this rusty stuff. I do also have some 800 grit sandpaper that'll go around and do more of the same. I just need to make sure this rusty nastiness is off of here and we have nice smooth bearing surfaces everywhere. Obviously the stuff outside of those bearing surfaces isn't as important. I've only just noticed this crank is missing a woodruff key. I'll have to find another crank to rob one out of. Shouldn't be too hard. Quite a bit of scrubbing and light sanding and washing and wiping and scrubbing and light sanding and washing again later. And the crank looks like this, significantly better. Yes, there's some coloration here on the weights and such. Don't really care about that. Most of these journals look beautiful. Got some light staining here. If you catch that in the right light, you can see the discoloration, but you can't feel that at all. It's just staining in the surface. Pretty much every journal has at least a little bit of that staining stuff. The worst of it is over on this side of the crankshaft. Here's the number 5/6 pin. Yeah, that's probably the ugliest, but again, you can't feel any of that. It's just staining. Number 5 main is like beautiful. Looks almost brand new except for this one little spot. If I was really concerned about this, I could take the crank in and have it polished by a machine shop, or I could break out a chunk of shoelace and some more paper and do a polish job here at home, but you're still gonna see that staining, and it's just not that big a deal. Giving the block a serious once over now. This number 6 bore had a good bit of surface rust in it. I scrubbed all of that out with the same techniques I was using on the crank, and as you can see, that's looking great now. Now, I did also go through and scrub every one of these lifter bores, particularly this one, because as you can kind of see on the edge right here, there was Gliptol over paint. I would say overspray, but I'm pretty sure Gliptol is brushed on. Apparently you can spray it, but whatever. There was some inside this bore. So I sanded that and I scrubbed all of them that had little small bits of surface rust. They're looking really good now, and I did just go through and drop a lifter into every one of these to make sure it would drop freely, and we're good there. After scrubbing those, I did blow out the oil galleys through the lifter feed holes. Yes, I'm fully committed to calling these galleys. No, I will not be changing my mind on that. I also scrubbed the deck surfaces. There was a little bit of orange staining you could see there. Nothing to be concerned with. A little bit more of that to do down here. You can see there's a good bit of rust staining on these saddles. As you saw, I test fit a camshaft in here and it spun just fine, but I did notice at least the front couple cam bearings were a little sticky, so I wiped all those out really well too. Main journals are looking great now. Little bit of light patchy stuff. Notice something I didn't like. When they painted this block, they painted the entire oil filter adapter mounting area. It's probably fine in here. I doubt the oil's going to lift that paint off or anything. But this is the high pressure sealing surface, and I don't want that to be painted. Look here, in particular, at this terrible, horrible run. Not good. So I'm scraping all that off. I've said this many times before, but it bears repeating. I'm no expert on engine building. If I can teach anyone anything about the subject, it's this methodology of checking everything and looking very close at the small details. I'd never seen that before, but I guarantee you it was bad news. I've discussed this plug in the oil passageway going from the sending unit downward toward the main cap at least once in the past. You always want to make sure that's in there. I'm now in the habit of doing that. That plug sits right here in the block, and it divides the sections of this vertical passageway that connect to these two horizontal ones. One of those comes out of the filter, one of those comes out of the pump. If that plug isn't in place, oil can go straight from the pump here upward to the sending unit and the rest of the oil feed areas, bypassing the filter entirely. I don't always think to check this, but I've seen issues with main cap fitment in blocks before, so I thought I'd set them on here and just make sure we get a nice press. That's exactly what you should have. A couple light hammer taps, it should seat. It shouldn't just fall in there. It shouldn't take a bunch of force. Now I have to pull them back out, of course. Ow! The caps all look really nice, and so do the main bolts. Of course, these are factory bolts. I did notice this one's a little rusty. Jamie, did you chase every single bolt hole in that block before assembling it? No, because the machine shop did that for me, as they pretty much always do. I'm not saying checking this is a bad idea. During the cleaning processes, gunk can end up gathered in these holes, and if your machinist does not take care of that for you, well, you could have a bad time when it comes time to assemble. Time to mess with some main bearings. We're going to clean and inspect every one of these. These pure Chinesium mains came pre-scraped right there, and with some yucky marks. Also some really thick shipping lube. Yeah, that's nice. Brand new, out of the package, pre-dinged. It'll clean up, but still. Some light work with 800 grit sandpaper, clean that right up. That's the good news. I don't know how excited I am about these cheapo bearings. These number 3 mains, with the thrust surfaces at least, really didn't want to go into their homes all that well. I guess that's better than the ones I've seen recently that just roll around in there all loosey-goosey. You know how at the beginning of this video I said it was Wednesday? Well, that was some movie magic. It was Monday when I said that, and it's Tuesday now. In the night, I was thinking about these bearings, and mostly about how I don't really trust them. So today, I'm going to attempt once again to do something I'm kind of not necessarily the best at, and that is take some precision measurements. In these engines, the bearing is actually a film of oil, which is captured between this bearing journal and the bearing shell that rests in the block. That oil in that gap is what's doing all of the work of keeping this thing off of the bearing shell and keeping the various bits of metal from disintegrating each other. The resulting gap between those two surfaces is therefore known as an oil clearance. It's that clearance that does the important work of making all of this happen. If this clearance is excessively loose, a loss of oil pressure can result, among other funky things. If this clearance is too tight, though, catastrophic engine damage is in your immediate future. You might notice that the shape of the shell here does not match the shape of the journal. For it to take its shape, it needs to be wedged into its home in the block or in the cap, and then the cap needs to be torqued in place onto the block. And this is why, before attempting to take any measurements, the bearings need to be installed and the caps torqued in place. Of course, all the bearings need to be cleaned first of fun little things like this. What am I even looking at here? That ain't pretty. It's going to clean up with 800, but look at that. It's like half the surface of this shell. That is crazy. I've never seen anything like it. This is after quite a bit of sanding with my trusty worn out piece of 800 grit. I'm thinking it's probably time for some new sandpaper. The rear bearing in these LA engines is special. Note it's wider than the other shells. Also, these are always fully grooved, whether it's a performance bearing set or not. You may not know this, but I used to run a professional mechanic shop, an engine building place called that. At one time, I started hoarding old machining equipment, thinking I could get to a point where I would take a core engine, do all of the necessary machining operations, and build it from the ground up. Unfortunately, I never became a trained machinist, so that plan didn't really work out. But one of the things I bought in that pursuit was a set of measuring tools. These are Matco branded outside micrometers. I'm sure Matco didn't actually make them. They've hardly ever been used, yet the calibration on the 2-inch to 3-inch mic here, which I'll be using for this operation, seems to be off by almost exactly 1/1000th. which does help to explain this. I started by measuring the journals on the crankshaft. The stock size of these main bearing journals is 2.810 inches. However, remember these have been turned 30 thousandths under size. That means the journals have been cut down to 2.78 inches nominally. I checked every single one of them and came up with 2.781. Now that we know this, that measurement makes some sense. And I can be sure that every one of these journals is ground to the correct size and they're all the same. I do have the spanner to calibrate these bad boys, but I already made the measurement as it is, so we're just going to do the same for the inside measurement, and then we'll have consistent numbers. Now, as far as taking the inside measurements of the bearing surfaces, there are various tools that can be used to accomplish that. I do not have a dial bore gauge, but I'm thinking at this point in my career, I'm long overdue to buy one. In the meantime, what I have are these, a set of telescoping snap gauges. There are a couple good guides on YouTube for how to use these things accurately. This is not one of them. So go watch one of those if you really want good info. But basically, you snap it in there carefully, a little bit off of center, snug this thing down, and then carefully sweep it through the middle of the bearing. As it sweeps through, these little tit things will be collapsed to the actual inner diameter, and then when it sweeps past, they should stay there as long as you got your tension set right here. Now I'm going to take this to the outside mic and measure it very carefully. With the snap gauge set, you set it inside your outside mic and ever so carefully screw the thimble down until it just touches. This is really done on feel, experience, which I don't have a whole lot of, and vibes. Because if you over tighten this thing, which is super easy to do, you're gonna press these little tits back into the tool and the reading is completely useless. To ensure accuracy, I repeated this measurement on the number 1 bearing several times. I also moved the tool to like a 45-degree angle off of vertical and checked again. I came up with the same number multiple times. It was very repeatable at 2.784. Obviously, for the bearing surface, we're looking for a number that is larger than the crank surface. And the difference between the two is going to be our oil clearance. 2.784 minus 2.781 gives us an oil clearance of 3 thousandths, or 0.003 of an inch. Now the factory specification is 5/10 thousandths to 2 thousandths, so that would be 0.0005 to 0.0020. Obviously, 0.003 is a good bit bigger than 0.002, but not all is necessarily lost there. I've done a bunch of reading on this subject, and basically no builders anywhere recommend you end up with a main bearing clearance that tight. The typical recommendation I see for a street engine is 0.0015. I found a piece of Chrysler literature indicating their race engines were to be at a 0.003 spec, so what we have here, and various builders online agree with that. Some say you should even go as big as 004 for extra protection and run a thicker oil. So if I've gotten accurate measurements here, which I'm now going to back up by checking every other bearing in this thing, we're on the higher side of what you would want for a street engine. But I'm kind of fine with that. The word among builders I could find information from said that 003 clearance will be fine with a high volume pump. So that's probably the way we're going to go here. If I find all of these bearings are passable, and that's still a big if. As small as this tool is, it is easy to check all of these bearings with them fully assembled, which is nice. Here I'm checking number 2. I came up with the same exact measurement for number 2, so I feel good about that. I'm certainly not an expert on reading one of these tools either, so I suggest you find a better guide for that subject as well if you're curious. This is a 2 to 3 mic, so you're starting with 2 inches, obviously. Then you've got your tenths. 7 is the highest tenth line that is exposed. You can see the angled hash mark there. So it's 2.7. These little lines are 25 thousandths each, so it's 2.775. And then we add the number here that lines up with that line, which is a 9. That gets us to 2.784. This mic actually has a 10 thousandths feature as well, but I don't believe in that. The number 3 bearing is coming in about a half a thou tighter. Now I guess we do have to look at the 10 thousandths thingy. Essentially, you see there are lines on the body of this thing, and then they kind of align with the lines on the thimble. They're graded differently, meaning the gaps between the lines don't match. So whichever one lines up correctly with the line on the thimble, which is 5 in this case, is the correct number you're looking for. Given that this landed right between 8 and 9, that seems about right to me. That would put our clearance here right in between these two numbers. Number 4 was the slightly goobered one with that crazy goop buildup on the surface, which I have lightly sanded. Even so, that one is coming in tighter than any of the rest of these at 2.782 and change, which would put the oil clearance right in the middle of this range. It's safe, but it's way tighter than the other ones. The all-important number 5 is right back where 1 and 2 were at 2.784. It is permissible to swap bearing shells around. What I'm going to try here is swapping the cap half from number 2 to number 4 and vice versa. We'll see if those numbers change. Number 2 now measures 2.7835, so we did affect a change there. We should see a similar amount of change in the other direction on number 4. As always on this channel, I want to be honest and explain the process as best as I can. So believe me when I tell you that this is kind of not easy. I've repeated this measurement of number 4 many times trying to see if I can detect a matching change on that bearing. And there is a change, but whether I'm getting a precise enough measurement of it, I don't know. I came up with measurements of 2.7825 and 2.7830. I've repeated this many times and they tend to be closer to that one, so I feel pretty good about it. It's not an exact matching change to this one though. But hey, if I'm within 5/10 thousandths, well, it's not great, but compared to my previous endeavors trying to make these measurements, that's pretty good. If that measurement was accurate, we're right here. Number 4 would still be our tightest bearing. It's a safe measurement though, and by the time I'm done sanding the rest of that ugliness off of there with some fresh sandpaper, I think we'll be good. Obviously, you want to be careful measuring these bearings. They're kind of delicate. You're always going to have little marks left behind, but that's nothing compared to what these bearings shipped with. Did you know that it's cold? Laughs in Minnesota. Got the heaty thingy on. It's not helping yet. Anyway, I've been working this bearing shell for a while and it looks like this. Much better, but you can still see the faintest of markings there. I'm good with it. I mean, it's not the prettiest thing in the world, but it's pretty flat other than those little gouges, most of which were from my thumbnail, allegedly. I don't know how it's going to look from your house, but I think it's good to go. I've told you I'm no good at this precision measuring stuff. I'll keep telling you till I'm blue in the face. So I've decided to back up these measurements with the good old-fashioned plastic gauge stuff. I'm going to check every one of these bearings just to compare. The green is good for 1 to 3 thousandths, so if my measurements were correct, it should barely be compressed at all for some of these gaps. The surfaces have to be dry, and we cannot spin it while doing the plastic gauge measuring process. Just torque these bad boys down and take it all apart again. Well, here are the results of the plastic gauge. 1 and 2 didn't even touch this stuff. It just fell right out. The world is a strange place. It just so happens that today, Just Mopar Joe is putting together a budget 318, and he's using plastic gauge to check bearing clearances. Watching him do that, I realized something I wasn't thinking of. Remember, these are full groove bearings, so they have grooves all the way around. The plastic gauge is going to end up bisected by that. There's also an oil hole though. I was trying to conserve plastic gauge and I used a really short section here on the front. I didn't get a read on it the first time because it ended up in that oil hole. Now that I've installed a slightly larger piece in a less dumb way, we got a good reading. Just thinner than 2 thousandths, incidentally. I feel much better about that, and I can now sleep at night. Of course, if you're keeping track at home, that doesn't match the measurement I took so well. I don't want to talk about it. Number 3 showed just over 2 thousandths. It was hard to get an accurate read on this, but it was in the range anyway. Number 4 was just below 3 thousandths. I made the mistake of breathing on this to blow off the chunk that was stuck in the gap in the fully grooved bearing, and all the material's basically gone. But you can just see the faintest mark on number 5. This one was just compressed, and on the little chart, it reads almost dead on 3 thousandths. The red would be the right stuff to use for these slightly larger oil clearances. It has a range of 2 thousandths to 6 thousandths. The green, unfortunately, is all that any parts store local to me had when I bought this stuff. I could order it in, but I don't really have that kind of patience. I certainly don't love the inconsistency in these measurements. I also don't know that another set of bearings would be much better. What I'm going to do now is lubricate these bearings and the journals on the crank, install the rear main seal, drop this thing in here, check the thrust, and see how it spins. I really think, in spite of these slight differences, everything's going to be fine. One tiny little problem with that. That's not a 360 rear main seal. That's a 318 rear main seal. There's a good note for you. In case you're not aware, a 360 is very similar to the other LA engines, 273, 318, and 340. But for some reason, they use a bigger main bearing. You can see comparing to this 318 crank just how big the difference is. I'm not familiar with the reasoning behind this change, but all 360s use that larger bearing size. As a matter of fact, this difference continued into the Magnum series. The 318 style journal measures 2.5 inches, while the 361 measures 2.810, in factory spec anyway. And as you can see here, the rear main surfaces are also a different diameter. I thought they would be the same as the bearing surface, but they're actually not. They're slightly larger. The 360 main caps are a good bit taller than the 318 main caps. It's probably a similar amount to the bearing surface difference. It wasn't so long ago that I learned 340s have taller main caps than 318s and 273s. This is, of course, to add extra beef to the bottom end. As you can see here, the 360 cap is ever so slightly taller than the 340 cap. The register area in the block is wider as well. But here you can plainly see this 340 uses the same small bearing as the other LAs, while the 360 uses the big one. I suppose the larger bearing offers more strength. It's spreading the load across more surface, and of course there's more metal around that, so there's more beef in general. The smaller bearing of the 340 though is better for lower frictional losses. In another move that makes zero sense at all to me, the rear sealing area for the oil pan was changed on the 360. Remember, it uses a larger main bearing, but this diameter is smaller. A 360 pan has to have a smaller area to match it, while a 273 318 pan will have this larger sealing area. It's actually the same sealing area front to back. Not so on a 360. This situation with two different oil pan fitments continued until the Magnum series. For the Magnum, Chrysler standardized this, with the 318 Magnum, like this one, getting the rear sealing area from the 360. So if you're trying to put one of these in a car for whatever reason, you actually need a 360 LA pan. I used to have a gasket set for this project, but I don't know where it went. Is it this? Oh, that's a conversion set. If it's a 360 one, it is. And this is the headset that goes with it that I've obviously robbed crap out of. And we have most everything. I don't actually know why they call these sets conversion sets. Maybe because it has everything you need to convert between fitting different applications? No idea. Anyway, it's essentially everything for the short block, everything that is not included in a headset. We've got our rear main seal, front main seal, timing cover, water pump, oil filter adapter. We've got our oil pan end seals. Note, these are the 360 style, so they don't match. We've got our pan rails there. The other engines use those little tails on one of the rear main seal halves. The 360 does not have that. Even so, I'm going to install the ends flush because that's how I roll. These halves will compress against each other when the cap is torqued into place, hopefully creating a perfect seal. Then we'll hit this with some right stuff and it'll be ready to rock. I've always been in the habit of installing these things dry. I thought that's what you were supposed to do. But I became enlightened by one of these Felpro packages earlier this year where it says lubricate surface of seal lips and crankshaft by applying a thin coat of motor oil or grease. Notice that's motor oil, not engine oil. If the engine will not be started within several days, grease is recommended. So that's what I'm going to do here. I don't know when this thing's going to run. Not a whole tube of this stuff, just a nice light coating. Doesn't take a whole tube of right stuff to do this job either. In fact, that's probably overkill. And now to lubricate some parts. Finally. And here we go. Carefully, Barry. Woo! Yeah. Now for some caps. I don't have my speed wrench. I gotta go get my speed wrench. Of course, I've already had these caps on and off like 3 times and I just spun them all by hand. So I guess we're fine. Number 5. I've seen multiple people, including just Mopar Joe, cleaning up these oil passageways on the cap and on the pumps and all of that stuff lately. I just can't be bothered to do that for an engine that's never gonna be living above 5,000 RPM. Hammer time! Nice. Obviously on this guy we need to be very careful because this is a sealing surface. It really doesn't take much. I've been asked in the past why I use a real hammer instead of like a dead blow or a soft face hammer or anything like that. I want that contact. I want that thunk, that snap between the two pieces. That's what does the work of setting these down. You're not wailing on them with a hammer. You're never going to damage them or break them or anything like that. You're just tapping them into place. Got distracted by filming, haven't pre-lubed the threads for the main bolts. I'm doing the rest of this the easy way. Power tools obviously are faster and easier, but the bottom end of your engine is no place to be using power tools. Okay, sometimes I do. Usually just to take things apart though. Now the fact that I hadn't oiled these threads before torquing the caps into place to check the clearances does in fact mean that the torque specs might have been a little off on these bolts, which means the clearances might not have been exact. It's fine. Sometime today. It certainly doesn't take much. You just want a little bit of oil on those threads. Put a stripe like that on there and it will distribute itself as you thread the bolt down. You also want just a titch under the head of the bolt. Would you give me actual oil, please? Thank you. Now I just do this a bunch more times. You can feel and hear the difference. Smooth, not so smooth. Now before I get too excited and torque all of these bolts down, I need to verify that the thrust is going to be acceptable. Thrust, or crankshaft end play, is the crank's movement from front to back. Now you need some, but not too much. Now I haven't snugged down the number 3 cap yet, and we have this. That looks a little on the excessive side to me, but we need to torque that thing down to be sure. You use a screwdriver between the block and one of the counterweights to move the crank in one direction and snug up those two halves of the thrust surface. I always put mine toward the front. With that number 3 cap taken down to its first torque stage, we now have this. I'm sure you can hear it. Hopefully you can see it. That's certainly more than I've seen in some engines. I am going to measure this. I'll put a magnetic base dial indicator on the front of the block, and we'll see what the movement actually is. Here I've got it zeroed with the crank toward the back, forcing it forward. We get that. 10 thousandths. The typical range for crank end play on a 360 LA Mopar is 2 thousandths to 7 thousandths. The absolute maximum is 10, and that's what we have. Well, call it 9 and a bit. Yet again, these cheapo Chinese bearings come in right on the bleeding edge of acceptability. Should I be ripping them out and getting some good name brand ones? Probably. Taking all of the mains out to their final torque spec of 85 pound-feet. Did you know that 3-wheeled engine stands are sketchy? I was like lifting that wheel off the ground while torquing. Time for the real moment of truth. How's she spin? Good. Yeah, that's nice. No horrible scrapies, no tight spots. In case you don't own a magnetic base dial indicator, you can check your thrust clearance with a feeler gauge. Here I've got 10 and it actually does fit in some spots, but it's pretty tight up here at the top. It won't go all the way through. 9 does though. Here's the 9 thou feeler gauge all the way around, just a skosh loose, fits everywhere. So that agrees with the reading we saw on the mic. Once again, what we have here is a case of the more you look, the more you're gonna find. That's why I usually choose not to look. I guess while I've still got it here, I can rob the Woodruff key out of this crank for our 360. A few different ways to get these out. Tapping it with a hammer on one side so it starts rocking that way is a good way to go. Because the little keyway that the key sits in is rounded on the bottom, kind of half moon shaped, when you press down on one side, obviously, it's gonna kind of rock and come out on the other. I've gotten it this far simply by using that technique. I did grab a brass drift, because we don't want to hurt this thing. Obviously, you could just go buy a new one of these, but that's not how we roll around here. Oh, I did hit this with some magic spray, by the way. Once you get it far enough, you can wedge a screwdriver or similar in here and carefully tap on it. Then it kind of just comes out. Obviously, it's a tight fit in the new crank. Kind of has to be. As long as it ends up straightish, it'll be good. Yeah, that's making the good noises. A harmonic balancer is another piece I don't seem to have for this project. I do have the one I took off the exploded Jordan 360. That should work perfectly fine. Don't you worry about the slightly roached rubber. All right, I'll look around for a better one. Anyway, it fits right over our new Woodruff key. Perfect. Now someone somewhere is screaming at their television, "Hey Jamie, shouldn't you check the rod bearing oil clearances too?" Yeah, I guess so. The LA Mopar uses a 2.125 or 2 1/8 inch rod bearing journal. This is the same between the smaller engines and the 360. Our rod journals have been undersized by 20 thousandths, so the resulting diameter should be 2.105 inches. I measured the number 1 journal, and wouldn't you know it, that's exactly what I got. Of course, what's weird about that is we know that this isn't accurate. Wait, am I dumb? Don't answer that. On the end of the thimble, you've got the little ratcheting guy, so you can't over torque this bad boy. I've now set it using that and reset the calibration to, well, as near to perfect as I could get it. Anyway, it's fine. And it measures that, so anyway, I guess we're good. Here's one of our new bearing shells. Hard to mess these things up, right? Just make sure you check for little scrapies on the back where they've been stacked on each other. Damage there could push this thing up in the cap, and that would mess up your clearance. We're adding a lot of stuff to the Check Everything file today. Here's another good one. Somehow, the big end of the number 1 rod here was dinged in several locations. Those dings raise material around them, and that would hold the cap up farther than it's supposed to be, which again would mess up the oil clearance. So I filed that down very carefully. The cap had some matching damage, but it was along the edge, not over here. I'm starting to wonder if maybe someone pried this apart with a screwdriver or something. You better believe I'm going to be checking every single rod and cap for similar damage. Notice the shell in the cap side is a little bit proud, while the shell in the rod is down a little bit at the edges. But they meet like so when they come together. And once I torque these fasteners, we can check our clearance here. Technically, because these are ARP fasteners, I should be using their lube and their torque spec. We'll do that for the final torque for sure. The brake and snap gauge sizes is right at 2 1/8, so I switched to the smaller one. I checked this a couple times and I came up with 2.108 repeatably. Subtracting the journal diameter of 2.1047, we're left with this for an oil clearance. 33 10,000ths, 3.3 thousandths, whatever. Just like the mains, this is on the big side. Apparently the high side of what Chrysler wants to see for these rods is 0.0034. So yeah, we're right there. We're definitely in running a high volume oil pump for safety territory, but I don't think this is obscene. For science, I did measure every other rod journal on the crank, and they're all right there on the money. It would be wise to measure every single rod bearing clearance, but I'm just not gonna do that. Obviously, I will be checking these for more fun damage spots as I go along. Well, it's a start. Circling back to hardware for this engine, since I can't really do anything else major at this point, I've realized a couple things. First, this is a car pan, and we're not going to be able to use that for the truck. We need a rear sump setup like this. And again, this has to be a 360 pan because the rear sealing area is different. I think I only have 1 or 3 of these. There's this one off of Jordan's engine. It's still full of horrible destroyed engine bits. This one here is liable to be a little less bad. I actually have a really nice Mylodon pan for a 360, but I'm hanging out of that for something special. Again, we need a timing cover too. This one will work. It's even black. LA timing covers are all interchangeable except for one thing, and that is the timing mark. Notice this is the 1969 and earlier style with the mark over here on the passenger side. The later engines, 70 and onward, use a mark over here. These covers were then the same until the end of the LA engine series in the early 90s. Or if not the same, functionally equivalent. One example of a change that was made over the years, the way the front seal installs. You can still bolt them onto the Magnum engines if you want to use the earlier LA accessories, and many people have. I used to think these 360 car pans were special or hard to come by or something. I have a lot of them. I do have a couple more 360 harmonic balancers here. Note, these are the earlier style with the external weight instead of the scallop taken out of the other side. Either one works. They're balanced the same. I think they just went to the other style because it was cheaper than adding this extra piece. Neither of these looks particularly great. They're both pretty rusty. I'm probably just gonna stick with what we've got. Now, I do not have the high volume oil pump or a truck pickup for this project yet. I'll put those on a list of stuff to order that I'll definitely forget about. Hold the phones. I actually have a nice new balancer. We'll go ahead and use that on this thing. I removed this flex plate from the same charger. This is also for a 360, and we're gonna need it when we drop this engine in that truck. One thing I'm not sure on yet is what intake manifold we'll be using on this 360. The only suitable thing I have on hand right now is this Edelbrock Performer RPM, and I don't really want to give that up. A more basic Performer would do the job if I had one to spare. I'm going to keep an eye out for other options in the coming weeks. Most of the other stuff we're going to need is already on here. We'll reuse that ignition. There's nothing wrong with it. The alternator's good, obviously the pulleys. I'll probably get a new water pump. The engine mount brackets on a 318 are slightly different than a 360, at least over here on the driver's side. I actually did a video all about swapping from 318s to 360s quite a while back, and if you're curious about the details there, you can go watch that. This might sound crazy to some of you, but we're planning to use these stock exhaust manifolds. Again, it's not exactly a race truck, and headers are absolutely terrible. I'm not going to start taking this truck apart until that 360 is basically ready to drop in. I want to make sure we can still move it around the yard and get it out of the way if need be. Because if there's one thing I've learned the hard way multiple times over, it's that pushing dead tin grill trucks around is not fun. Anyway, until I bring my ring grinder home from Rocket, I can't really do anything else on assembling this thing. I've got to do some soul searching on those components I discussed, camshaft, intake, etc. Oh, I need a timing set. Remind me to order a timing set. Anyway, in the coming weeks, I should have all of those mysteries solved, and I'll get back to assembling this thing. Until then, as ever, thanks for watching. And remember, there are real engine builders, and there are dirty hacks. Me, I aspire to be right in the middle. I like it here. And it's right back in the same hole. Nice. Real nice. What are you looking at?